Free Association, Snapshots of Electroacoustic Musical History. The title of my talk refers to the conceptual path I'd like to trace for you, a path that outlines part of my own history and experience of experimental music, focusing particularly on electroacoustic music. There's only one of the many possible paths through this musical territory, but it is the one that feels most relevant to my own work. Some of the examples I will discuss originate in acoustic music traditions, and I include them because they have played an important part in my approach to music and working with electronics in particular. The phrase free association in my title refers to both the connections between ideas that I will be suggesting and to the free association in computer network music, a musical form that I will be talking about later. A free association between players, between notes, and between musical parameters. I'd like to start with a few comments about jazz artist and composer Thelonious Monk. I first heard Monk's music on an LP my older brother brought back from New York in 1959 when I was 9 years old. He had heard Monk play with orchestra at the famous Town Hall concert, recorded and released on Riverside Records. I immediately took to Monk's compositions and the sound of certain pitch intervals prominent in his music. There were tritones and supported by tenths on the bottom, which is a common jazz sonority. From that time on, I became a big fan of Monk's music. An important characteristic of his approach, which I find has deeply influenced my own music and my approach to electronics in particular, is his seemingly unhesitating acceptance of his own physical characteristics at the piano, technical limitations included, and more importantly, the way he used those characteristics in building a unique musical sensibility. It is as if the force of his musical personality forged a coherent statement out of the disparate elements he was actually hearing coming out of the piano when he sat down to play. Whether this is really the way Monk worked or thought about his work is of course debatable, but I think it is one way to view what he accomplished. My view emphasizes the empirical nature of musical invention, an embrace of the humanly and physically actual, imperfections and all, as a source of musical richness. An additional comment about improvisation. Improvisation can be defined in part as an openness to internal and/or external influence at any moment. This image brings to mind a certain set of musical features: a merging of independent streams, momentary correspondences and tuning between parts, a uniting of different acoustic spaces, as well as being nudged off course, interruption effects, even sudden derailments, etc. Improvisation really means free association in the moment between players and free association between musical ideas for the listener as well. An openness to internal or external influence at any moment also brings to mind the music of Charles Ives. The Alcott's movement of his second piano sonata, Concord, opens with what can be described as a child's reiterative practicing of the motive from Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. As the motive is gradually elaborated, a sudden far-off inclusion of bell-like chords is overlaid in the upper register. The insertion of this quiet chiming immediately expands the dimension of the child's room to the limits of the surrounding town. It is as if someone opened the window and what was outside was brought in this case, the sound of church bells from a distant steeple. Some of the harmonic complexity of Ives' music can be viewed as an inclusive expansion of this kind, an incorporating of audible streams coming from the environment. I include mention of it here because the kind of distant pitch correspondence in the music of the computer network band, the Hub, can have a similar quality. In that group, pitch material is often arrived at independently by each hub player, and therefore momentary pitch relationships between players can occur by virtue of simple proximity in time, or as strict correlations that are the result of data exchange between computers. In either case, the sense of expansion of musical space, like in Ives, the room has just gotten a little bigger. seems like an apt way to describe the result. To jump now into the electroacoustic arena, let's reflect for a moment on the example of composer David Cooter. Cooter pioneered the use of live electronics in music performance in the early 1960s. He envisioned electronic circuits as musical actors rather than as instrumental tools. He bypassed many common assumptions about the role of electronics in music making. Cooter wasn't interested in extending instrumental colors with electronic processing, nor was he interested in conventional notions of electronic control. What he did do was dig down into the micro level of the circuit and try to release the instabilities that lay hidden there. He then cast these instabilities as self-modifying musical agents. What a source of musical richness. His performances were defined in large part by a new musical dynamic arising from unstable configurations of analog circuits. Outputs were fed back into inputs. Amplitude controls were set to operate in extreme parts of their range, and the slightest intervention by a human performer could send the circuit into new areas of sonic behavior. Cooter's search for circuit configurations that were supersensitized and unstable, a completely different approach from most composers working with electronics at that time. A number of composers followed Cooter's example, among them Gordon Mumma. In thinking about Mumma's work, it is interesting to step back a minute and think about the nature of musical time and the way it was changed by the work of John Cage, someone who was an enormous influence on both Cooter and Mumma. In Cage's work from the early 1950s on, he posits a kind of observational listener. In some sense, the flow of traditionally directed rhythmic time in these works is permanently derailed, and we are placed at the center of a more internal progression of time, a position from which we can perceive sound events as forming constellations, partly in the present and partly in the past. Listeners are not carried along via a rhythmic flow as much as they metaphorically walk forward under their own steam and come upon sounds, or sounds come upon them, sometimes waiting expectantly, sometimes surprised when events occur, but above all content to take what comes when it comes. Of course, one can describe this type of unfolding as a flow as well, though is a flow more akin to a moving observer paying close attention to passing environmental features, large and small. It is more like the flow of mental contemplation. Gordon Mumma, in his piece Hornpipe from 1967, expands on this observational listening stance. The horn player in Mumma's piece plays somewhat the role of lab technician, inputting information into the acoustic environment in the form of tones and impulses, and then observing and or responding to what the environment gives back. In Mumma's case, the electronic circuit interaction with the player and the environment defines the music. Expanding on Cooter's circuit functionality, Mumma adds an analysis stage to the front end of the electronics, and then in performance, executes a prescribed sequence of actions: play, listen, change location, play again, and so on. Each playing cycle feeds new information into the analysis component, and as the play tones are mixed with the reflected audio response from the room, the combined result further guides the circuit's sonic output. An elaborate informational, rather than audio, feedback system is what Mumma has constructed. The required sequence of actions is not only sonically necessary for the piece to fully operate, it also gives the performance a specific theatrical contour. In Hornpipe, composer-listener is projected as scientist-experimenter, though of course not really a scientist in a strict sense. Contemplation and appreciation of the larger system, including initiator and environment, in all its detail as it acts in time, becomes the aesthetic object. Again, as in Cage, the role of observer is inserted into the flow of musical time. By prying this kind of opening in musical time, all manner of imaginative listening has room to exist. Two of Mumma's colleagues, Robert Ashley and David Behrman, also took advantage of just this kind of opening. Their work with electronics in the 1970s suggested new electroacoustic ways of structuring music. They created circuits to detect and enhance correlations between parts, to demarcate freely occurring structural points, and to elaborate natural contours within sounds. The electronics often highlighted correspondences between parallel streams of sonic material. In Ashley's string quartet, describing the motions of large real bodies from 1972, random string impulses produced by the quartet are delayed and coupled electronically with original impulses in such a way that coincidences between the two trigger further material. David Behrman's work from around the same time focused on pitch detection schemes where real-time melodies or real-time melodic choices by an instrumentalist trigger clusters of harmonic change. The two parts, acoustic and synthetic, proceed together in beautiful symbiosis. Behrman's pitch matching pieces from the late 1970s, such as On the Other Ocean, were made on some of the first computers to become available to the general public. They are a wonderful bridge between the self-propelled analog circuits of Cooter and Mumma and the live computer music made by the next generation of composers. Let's think for a moment about the advent of personal computer technology and its effect on the experimental music community I'm discussing. The switch to computer-based electronics is a profound one for many reasons, one of the most important being the loss of the rich failure modes characteristic of analog devices, which were so important to the liveliness of Cooter's and Mumma's output. Of course, composers, since the arrival of the digital devices, have based pieces on the operational edges of the new technology as well, and there have been some beautiful results. But in the long run, I feel the shift to digital has necessitated a more methodical approach to lively interaction, and Behrman's example is an early sign of such development. His elegant synthetic harmonies, which change under the melodic influence of a solo player, focus our attention more on periodic structural correspondence than on the continual micro-level volatility of audio generation itself. Another way of putting this is that some of the musical heat is taken off the timbral dimension and is distributed outwardly away from the micro-present into a broader time scale, creating a more stately sense of forward momentum. A momentum which is nudged forward by surprising instances of pitch alignment and sudden harmonic change. In Behrman, the feeling of physical agency, human or electronic, is still there, but in a less charged form. Some have not been attracted to this cooler world, but I find Behrman's example liberating. His work helped to lessen the constricting forces of the long, dominant timbral obsession of electronic music and open the field up to other kinds of organizing structures. He created a more methodical, self-aware music where neighboring components seem to talk to one another, decide their fate in the moment, then move off together or separately. This model could be applied to other parameters as well, and elaborations and diversifications of this kind of musical structuring are a chief feature of computer network music and the Computer Network Music Forum as was practiced by the League of Automatic Music Composers and the Hub. Of course, Behrman was a part of the former group for a period of time. The listening perspective of Behrman again expands upon the Cagean observational stance I've described, but this time there's more specific focus on tuned correspondence, the noticing of which informs in part musical structure. The League of Automatic Music Composers started in 1978. Band members generally adapted solo, computer-based compositions for use within the group. These solos were developed independently by each composer and were typically based on algorithmic schemes of one kind or another. There was a distinctly improvisational character to many of these, as the music was always different in detail. Mathematical theories of melody, experimental tuning systems, improvisational instrument design, and interactive performance were a few of the areas explored in these solo works. More often than not, the composer designed real-time controls so that a human player could adjust the musical behavior of the algorithm in performance. These openings in the algorithm became important features when adapting the solo within the network band context. They were natural points where incoming data from other players could be applied. The solos, played simultaneously in the group setting, became interacting sub-compositions, each sending and receiving data pertinent to its musical functioning. This was accomplished by laboriously connecting our computers together, often wire by wire, to allow the flow of data from machine to machine in performance. The internet didn't exist yet. We built our own local network within a single room. The Hub formed as a group in 1986 and is still active today. The group practice over all these years manifests many of the features I have been describing. Do with what is available now rather than wait for a more perfect technology. Use an empirical approach that pays close attention to emerging behaviors of the network. Define pieces by unique configurations of components. Open parallel audio streams to alteration from outside information. Encourage an observational listening stance, improvisation, etc. I don't mean to say the Hub is a culmination of these historical practices, but more to point out part of the conceptual context in which the group arose and to outline some of the approaches that have informed our thinking. Network music has allowed us an alternative style of social connection within the domain of music performance. In the Hub, the essence of each piece is the data exchange protocol, which in our group is referred to as the piece spec, short for specification. The spec is the definition we all start with when beginning work on a piece. In the social dimension of the group, the spec is not only the common starting point, but also, I think, a welcome social insulator between band members. It eliminates a lot of the somewhat awkward, upfront verbalization about what we're going to do. Each player can develop their own musical response to the spec without running it by the other players. In the best piece, the spec is the mediator between players, which allows multiple approaches to exist concurrently in a coordinated musical space. Our faith in the spec to handle coordination duties allows each of us to focus on the development and integrity of our own part. The Hub's music really relies on the strength of independent development to work properly. You can't come in empty-handed and borrow someone else's code and expect to get the same result. A developed electroacoustic musical viewpoint is a requirement of the music. I'll build my own musical continuity, you build yours, and the data exchange will take care of a critical part of the coordination between us. To conclude, I've often thought of network music as a kind of expanded polyphony, where instead of multiple melodic lines that form harmonies, you have multiple musics aligned through diverse parameter correspondences, a sonic fabric knit together of independent musical personalities. It is as if each Hub part declaims its own idea of what music is, and it is the interaction between these declarations, the agreements, disagreements, oblique agreements, interruptions, merging, diverging, ignoring, cajoling, attending, and the resulting musical shapes and contours that are the focus of the form. It is also important to allow for non-structure as you listen to the Hub. Only then can we appreciate the coalescing of momentary structures within the music and the surprising instances of odd correlation. In the early days of the League, back in 1978, we imagined that once people discovered network music, it would take off like wildfire. That didn't exactly happen. But in the last few years, there's been definitely more interest, especially in Europe, and I'm looking forward to being surprised by what comes of it. Thank you.
Do you still perform?
Yeah.
Where is the next one we can hear?
Right now, there's no performances coming up, but if you want to write me at Mills College, I can let you know. I do a lot of solo performance and other groupings, but the hub itself, it's maybe, we've been going so long, but one of the things about the group, it's a lot of work. It's always been a lot of work, and at the age we are now, we're a little farther apart. Everyone's got their own independent careers, so it's harder to get everyone together. And you have to. So thanks for asking.
Any other questions?
Question.
Yeah.
What was the relationship between Cooter and, say, the Moog synthesizer? Who influenced whom, or
That's a good question. Cooter used those early analog synthesizers, like the Bootler particularly, and the Moog, but not a lot, because his style of analog circuit, use of analog circuits was more idiosyncratic, and one time someone described to me that a Cooter concert is, he arrives at the new city, he goes to the concert hall and spends 6 hours plugging together all his electronic boxes, separate boxes in a completely unique configuration for that day. And whatever's working, he uses. And you could do that on a Moog, but it would be much harder to reconfigure it like that.
Okay.
But that's a really good question.